stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am continuing my review of the player cards in the Pallid Mask, the 4th Mythos pack in the Path to Carcosa cycle. I am looking at the Mystic cards in this episode. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. I've been playing a lot of Mystic lately, and there is one particular card in this pack that I am very excited about, so let's get started. The first Mystic card in the pack is a new skill. This is Torrent of Power. It has a wild skill icon, the practice trait, and the game text. As an additional cost to commit Torrent of Power to a skill test, spend up to 3 charges from among assets you control. For each charge spent this way, Torrent of Power gains 1 willpower skill icon and 1 wild skill icon. Torrent of Power is only the second card in the game that allows you to use charges as something other than a way of powering your spells. The other card, of course, is Spirit Speaker, Envoy of the Elusi, Akachi Onyele's signature asset from the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion. And it allows you to move all of your charges from an asset to your resource pool as resources. Torrent of Power gives you another option. You can convert those charges to skill icons at a very favorable exchange rate. For each charge you spend after you commit Torrent of Power, you get a willpower skill icon and a wild skill icon. If you go all in when you commit Torrent of Power, you get 3 willpower skill icons and 4 wild skill icons, which should be enough to pass just about any willpower skill test, regardless of whether you're playing on easy, standard, hard, or expert difficulty. Committing 4 wild skill icons to an intellect, combat, or agility test isn't too shabby either. It makes it one of the close to one of the best skills in the game for that. The big question is whether you'll have the charges to spare when you unleash your Torrent of Power. There are slightly more than a dozen cards that use charges currently in the game, and most enter play with 3 or 4 charges, the exception being Song of the Dead from the Miskatonic Museum Mythos pack, which enters play with 5. Now, I don't know about you, but charges tend to be a very precious commodity when I'm playing an investigator with access to cards in the Mystic class. It's a very rare game indeed that I have any charges left at the end of a scenario. And that really makes me wonder how many spare charges I'm going to have lying around to spend on a card like Torrent of Power, unless you're playing an asset solely for the purpose of fueling it. For example, you might include a card such as Alchemical Transmutation in your deck just for the charges to spend them on Torrent of Power. Now, there are several ways of getting more charges. The easiest way, of course, is playing Akachi Onyele, who adds 1 additional charge to assets that use charges when they enter play. Torrent of Power works well in Akachi because you can play it in conjunction with the Spirit Speaker. For example, you could spend 3 charges on Shriveling to generate icons with Torrent of Power, then bounce that Shriveling back to your hand using Spirit Speaker, so you can replay it on using another action, and thereby refreshing all of the charges on it. Beyond playing Akachi, your options are fairly limited. There are ways of adding additional charges to assets once they enter play, but as you're probably aware if you've listened to my previous card reviews, I'm not a big fan of those cards. Both versions of Book of Shadows are really inefficient, and Recharge has the potential to blow up in your face, discarding the asset as well as any remaining charges on it, and it certainly has a risk involved if you want to try to add charges that way. The limited nature of charges makes me think that Torrent of Power is the type of card you're going to be playing toward the end of a scenario to try to seal a victory. If you're playing Curtain Call, for example, you might consider burning any remaining charges on your Rite of Seeking or Shriveling to help you defeat the man in the Pallid Mask using an Investigate action on his card. Those charges were probably going to go to waste anyway, so converting them to willpower and wild skill icons makes a lot of sense. If you don't have any charges to spare, then you can still commit Torrent of Power for a wild skill icon. Wild skill icons are still relatively rare on level 0 cards in the Mystic class. There are only 4 cards with them, those being Word of Protection from the core set, Defiance from the Blood on the Altar Mythos pack, Quantum Flux from a Phantom of Truth, and of course Torrent of Power. The only problem with Torrent of Power is that, unlike the other cards with wild skill icons, it's effectively blank unless you're spending the charges to power it up. So I'm not convinced that Torrent of Power is worth the deck slot just for the wild skill icon when better options exist. I really like how the designers are treating charges as an additional resource that Mystics can spend to generate resources or skill icons, and I'm really hoping to see more cards that do that in the future. Torrent of Power is a natural fit in an Akachi deck. However, I could see other investigators with access to the Mystic card pool taking the card for a spin as well. Who knows, maybe there's a Jim Culver deck that uses Song of the Dead to power it up. That might be an interesting area to explore. And I could also see it being played quite a bit at higher levels of difficulty. It's really hard to pass up pitching 7 willpower icons to a skill test. That would be fantastic if you're playing on hard or expert. That said, you can maximize Torrent of Power only if you've got the charges to spare, and they do tend to be very limited resource for investigators besides Akachi. That suggests to me you need to build around Torrent of Power a little more than other class skills in the pack. Otherwise, you're going to commit it to a skill test for a single wild skill icon, and that's far from ideal considering the potential that the card has. The second Mystic card in the pack is an upgrade for Scrying, an asset from the core set. This version of Scrying will set you back 3 experience points. It costs 1 resource, has 2 intellect skill icons, the spell trait, and takes up an arcane slot. It enters play with 3 charges, and it has the game text, free trigger, exhaust Scrying, and spend 1 charge. Look at the top 3 cards of any investigator's deck or the encounter deck. Return them to the top of that deck in any order. If a Terror or Omen card is among the looked at cards, you take 1 horror. I have been looking forward to an upgraded version of Scrying since the core set. The card features some of the best art in the game, and I really enjoy playing decks that try to control which cards the encounter deck is feeding me. In fact, I don't think I've actually used Scrying to look at the top 3 cards of any investigator's deck. That has always seemed sort of like a waste of time compared to manipulating the encounter deck, which is the deck that's trying to kill you. Needless to say, I was pretty excited when I found out that the level 3 Scrying was in the Pallid Mask. I had sort of pegged it to come out in another version of Scrying might come out in the Return to the Night of Zealot product, but I'm glad to see it here a little earlier than I thought. Now, I've built control decks around a few different investigators, including Daisy Walker, Safina Russo, and Norman Withers. In theory, you should be able to use cards such as Scrying, Alyssa Graham, Dr. William T. Mallison, and Split the Angle, which is Norman Withers' signature asset, to neuter the impact of the encounter deck. Knowing which encounter card you're going to draw next is a fantastic bit of information to have, and you can really plan your turn accordingly. You know when it's safe to delve too deep, you know which icons you need to pass an upcoming skill test, and you can ship potentially deadly enemies to the bottom of the deck, or at least delay their arrival for a couple of turns so you have a chance to fight them on your own terms. There's just one problem I've found with these types of decks right now, and that's that they're just too slow. Every time you take an action to play Scrying or rig the encounter deck with it, you're sacrificing a little bit of your tempo, and if you sacrifice too much tempo, you really risk falling behind the agenda deck. And it's been my experience that the more you use the Scrying, the farther you fall behind, and once you run out of control tricks, the encounter deck reverts back to being its nasty self, and you simply don't have the time to dig yourself out of the hole that you've dug for yourself. Level 3 Scrying should help make those types of decks more viable because it swaps the action icon for a free trigger icon. You're still going to take a tempo hit when you play level 3 Scrying, but at least you don't lose any tempo when you trigger it, which I think is a big plus. However, as with most Mystic spells, there is a catch. If a Terror or Omen card is among the looked at cards, you will take one horror. Terror and Omen cards are actually quite common in encounter decks. There are 21 Terror cards in all, ranging from the ubiquitous Frozen in Fear and Rotting Remains to the Whispers in Your Head set from the Path to Carcosa. There are also at least 13 Omen cards, ranging from Ancient Evils and Black Star's Rise to Twist of Fate, which was a very common encounter card in the Dunwich Legacy. There's a good chance if you look at the top 3 cards of the encounter deck, you're going to take a horror. Now, taking a horror is annoying, but I'm not too worried about it in isolation, since Agnes, Akachi, Jim, Marie, and Norman usually have plenty of sanity to spare. You could start to run into trouble, though, if you're playing level 3 Scrying in conjunction with other cards that can ping you for horror, such as Shriveling. Shriveling seems to ping me for a horror at least once or twice a game, and I'd be a little concerned about taking even more from Scrying. So it may be worth taking a look at some of the cards that provide some healing, and including those in your deck if you're planning on using both of those cards. As I mentioned, I really enjoy fooling around with the control style decks, and the free trigger on level 3 Scrying should make it easier for them to keep pace with the agenda deck. I'm not convinced these control style decks are tier 1 or anything like that, and I have my doubts they ever will be. The designers need to be very careful when creating cards that interact with the encounter deck, because if they push them too far, they could make the encounter deck irrelevant, and that would be really bad for the game. Those of you who have played the Lord of the Rings LCG are probably aware of how at least one crafty player was able to use a combination of cards in that game to actually remove the entire encounter deck from the game, so you didn't have to encounter any of them, and that I'm sure the designers would prefer to avoid repeating that mistake. I think they've done a good job balancing level 3 Scrying, and I've got just the deck I'd like to try it in. So, but that's a discussion for another time. That's going to do it for my review of the Mystic cards in the Pallid Mask. I'm looking forward to playing with both of these cards. Torrent of Power has the potential to be quite powerful if you've got the charges to spend on it. I'd look to include it in an Akachi deck first, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out playing it in other investigators as well. Like I mentioned, perhaps Jim Culver could play it with Song of the Dead, use all those charges there. You need to build around it to a certain extent, but there's no shortage of assets that enter play with charges on them, so you should be able to find something that fits the bill. Level 3 Scrying is going to find a home in at least one of my decks. I'm looking forward to triggering it, certainly without taking that action. I'm not looking forward to taking a horror if I see a Terror or Omen card, but I think the tempo boost the card provides is worth the risk. And don't forget that you can also use it to rig your draw deck should the need arise. Sometimes if you're just not drawing the card you need, you can use a Scrying charge to get it into your hand that much faster. That's going to do it for me today. If you enjoyed this review, I'd appreciate it if you could leave me a thumbs up. It helps out the channel a great deal. Have you had a chance to play with Torrent of Power or Scrying? Do you have any opinions on these cards? Make sure you leave a comment down below. I always enjoy hearing from you. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of when I release future content. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.